Okay, so first of all, before we actually talk about Henrik Ibsen's The Dollhouse, or yeah, I'm going to call it The Dollhouse several times because depending on the translation, I've seen it, A Doll's House, I've seen A Doll House, I've seen The Doll House. Some people I've seen just say Doll's House. So it's grammatically, I don't know that, I think there's a lot of possibilities. It really depends on the translator. But this was originally in Norwegian, so we are reading a pretty modern translation. I mean, though this is through, I do want to make sure and give credits to Project Gutenberg. They do a lot of, they're trying to make all of the open source texts open to people so they can get them from wherever they live in the world. And so they do have, they're essentially their project was to get every single thing in every language, to be translated into English and available. So kudos to them. I don't suggest if you ever want to read another play and you're thinking, oh, I'll go back to, Greek mythology or something. I do not suggest reading Oedipus the King or Oedipus Rex through this website because they actually use all the Roman god names instead of the Greek. It's very confusing. And in fact, their version doesn't actually include the end. And so I taught it once in world literature and it was about Oedipus the King. And then I told about the ending and they're like, what? What happened? Because they actually missed the ending. It's really terrible. And it's a tragedy. So the ending really does matter. In this case, though, this is not technically a tragedy. Oh my goodness, Addie, I didn't even see you. Thank you, Jordan, let me mark down Addie as being here too. Do, do, do. Okay, so Addie, you go as Addie. I have you marked it two different ways, so I'll just put those together so that I make sure you get all of the credit for all the times you've come. Because sometimes it says Addie and sometimes it says Adonaiah. So okay, yay! So you're here, and if you guys see if I don't say somebody's name and you see they pop over in the participants, just let me know because I a friendly hey, you're not paying attention, Dr. Carhall, and I will make sure because I want to make sure and always give credit to people who are attending because that will add to your ability to do well in this class. And I mean, not just because it's a fun place to be, but because I actually mark it down and make note of who's coming. So, okay, so A Doll's House. Before we start on Act One, we're going to try to get through Act One today. If we don't, anywhere we end, we will start up the next time. But it gives me a chance to talk about play structure. Now, it used to be, I say used to be, like back in Shakespeare's time when we will be reading The Tempest this week and next, actually. But The Tempest is actually separated into 5 acts. That is much more normal for the past theater. In fact, is with Greek plays, they weren't even separated really by acts. They had scenes, and then each time a person left or came back on, it was a different scene. And then they would be separated by these kind of choral episodes where they were all chanting stuff. But by the time we get to Shakespeare's time, most plays are in a much more of a 5-act. And usually the climax would be at the very end of the 4th act or something like that. And so that was typically how they rounded this. Now, with acts 1, 2, and 3, like this, that is not going to be the case. So if we're looking for the climax of a play, the climax should be where essentially, remember what I said but when I was talking about the Freytag's pyramid, is the climax is that point of no return. And if you are a big fan of Phantom of the Opera, the point of no return in Phantom of the Opera, the actual real climax is not when that song is being played and sung. But there is a song in Phantom of the Opera called Past the Point of No Return, and it's actually not the climax. The climax is far later in the play when Christine makes her choice. So most of the time in modern movies today, the climax is very late, very, 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 very late, because the falling action is probably the least interesting of all of the stuff that happens in play. With the Dollhouse, now we have 3 acts. you can pretty much bet any 3-act play or 2-act play or something like that, the climax is going to be in the last act. It's going to be the point at which someone makes a choice that is irretrievable. And in this case, it is not up to Nora, the wife in this play, when the climax happens. It's up to Torvald, her husband. He's the one who essentially makes the climactic action. And we're going to talk about that, kind of how do they build the tension all the way through? What's it built upon? What are they worried about, fretting about, unsure about, what's being hidden, what lies are being told, that kind of stuff. And where does it reach that point when everything just falls into place and there is no other action to take? The truth is, though, like many of Henrik Ibsen's plays, he's a realistic playwright, one of the first playwrights in that kind of new genre of realism in theater. And many of his plays ended with people literally standing up and walking out angry. And this is one of those plays. So another one that he wrote that made people angry was Hedda Gabler. And I think it's actually Gabler. It looks like that, but it's pronounced Gabler. And Hedda Gabler is kind of, I don't know, super bored or something, so she has ennui, and she's bored with life, and she thinks that everything's not going to go her way. And in the end, I'm going to tell you because it's not in this play, but in the end, she chooses to commit suicide. And honestly, I don't even get it. I read it and go, what's wrong with her life? But she was just, I don't know, dissatisfied and filled with ennui. But in this case, since you guys, think about today's time, and much of the, you have to, in some ways, even though this is realistic play, you have to put it in context. And so at this time of this play, a lot of the actions that especially that Nora took at the end would have been seen as horrific, but but they would also be probably more understandable in some ways to them than to us. So, but at this time, they were living in a culture where, let me see if I can see when it was originally published. That's the most recent publication date. Let me look for a second. Actually, I'll just look it up. I'll do the lazy thing and I'll Google it. Okay, so what I'm going to do. (1879). I knew it was the late 19th century, but I didn't want to tell you the wrong date. So that makes a huge difference. At this time, I'm just going to have to move back to what I want. At this time, women could not own property. They literally were not legally allowed to own property at all. Even if you made some sort of, bequest and gave your daughter a dowry, or said, well, this property over here is hers, she really couldn't own it outright. She could own it in trust, sort of. Well, it would be held in trust in your name for her to own it, because women simply were not allowed to own property. So their dowry, if there was an amount of money that the parents were willing to pay for whenever they got married, that dowry would go straight to the husband, and the husband could do anything he wanted with it. There was no such thing as custody. There was no such thing as, like parental rights, who gets visitation, or none of this was, at this time, women, it was rare that women, especially upper class women, like Nora is much more upper class, but it was rare that she would work. And even if she did, her money, her earnings, her salary would go to her husband. She literally could not even have a bank account of her own. And so it's essential to understand this, because otherwise some of what she does doesn't make sense, and some of the reasons people are upset, they don't make sense. But when she was married, once she married, all of her property that had been given to, by her dad or whatever, all that property would go to her husband, and he could literally do anything he wanted with it. So he could sell it all. He could gamble away all the money. He could give all the money away to charity. He could do anything he wanted with it, and there's nothing she could do to stop that legally. In fact, when in England, when women were working for suffrage, they were trying to get the right to vote. England actually had to institute in 1900. They made it legal for women to own property, because at that time you couldn't vote if you didn't own property. So that means any of us out here, so, and you guys are listening hopefully with the, on the recording, but any of us who did not own a house, if you were renting your house, or you were living with your parents, or were renting a mobile home, or no matter what it is, if you didn't own property, you could not vote. So today, if that law were still in place, then a large millions of people within this country alone would not be able to vote legally, because they wouldn't own a home. If you don't own property, you can't vote at this time. Now they changed that law. First of all, they made it so women could own property. And then 2 years later, in 1902, women were able to vote legally in England. They couldn't vote in the United States until when? Do you have any idea? Do you remember the date? Close, Jordan. 1920. In fact, that was the first election where women were voting. And 100 years later, when we were in the last election in 2020, women were actually taking their vote stickers, and they put plastic around the Susan B. Anthony's grave, and they were putting voting stickers on her grave to say, "Yay, I voted," in essentially deference to her, because she was one of the people who were instrumental in the suffrage movement here in the United States. But yeah, in 1920, women could finally vote. But actually, what they changed is they changed the voting laws so that you didn't have to own property to vote. And they did that back in the mid 19th century. But women still weren't allowed to vote here until 1920. Okay, so we're dealing with a time period when women had really no rights. They had none. And they had no rights to own anything. They had no rights to get a loan, to have a bank account, to make their own choices, especially if they were married. If they weren't married, it was up to their parents. If they were married, it was up to their husband. And so that's I just want to make sure you understand all of that. Now, how does this act start? What's going on? I mean, obviously, it seems like, well, first of all, what season of the year is it? And I scrolled back down so that you would, it's kind of timely. It's always fun to teach this in the fall. Yes, it's Christmas. And this should be one of those happy festive plays. It should be what one of those Hallmark Christmas movies, right? But that's not what this is. It's not a Hallmark Christmas movie. It's beautiful. The stage was probably going to be a very elaborate set with working doors, the windows looked real, everything looked very realistic. The furniture would have looked, remember, this is the era of realism. So everything was going to look as much like a real house on the stage as possible. And you can find versions of this, some really good ones on YouTube, actually, of this play. Make sure you look for ones that are in English, because of course there are some in Norwegian. I've seen a few in French translation, but you want to read it obviously you want to view it in English if possible. But there are some good versions of this play that are available if you want to watch it, just like you did Trifles. But most of the productions, even today, that are done are going to be very realistic, where the costumes are very much of that time period. The setting, the furnishings, even the doilies or whatever on, and the lamps and everything else, all of the different decorations inside of the house would look time specific. And you notice that the stage directions are very specific, right? And so it not only talks about what furnishings there are, but where they are and exactly what's on where and what's on what walls. And this is going to be the standard really through the early 20th century. So by about 1930 or so, playwrights are moving away from this kind of elaborate stuff, but some of the biggies still, do a bunch of description like this, but this is all stage direction. So just telling us what it's, of course, nobody would read this, but they're already, she's actually coming in after shopping, and there's a porter behind her who's carrying a Christmas tree and a basket. And the Christmas tree is probably not a large one. So it's not like what we're used to, where you fill the whole room with it. It's probably a very small, a much smaller tree. But she says, of course, she's hiding the Christmas tree. And then she says, be sure the children do not see it until this evening when it's dressed. Now, of course, that's suggesting that this is a tradition. Now, in my family, I don't know what you guys do, but my kids tend to decorate with me. And when I was a kid, I decorated, we decorated as much as anybody else did. In fact, my dad really liked decorating the tree. But I don't know if you guys, my daughter and a friend of hers and I actually decorated ours before Thanksgiving this semester. Oh, you decorate together too? And I think it's but again, everybody does it differently. Now, at this time, of course, they didn't have electric lights. So they would have done the candles. And that's one thing that was really rare, is they would actually affix the candles onto the tree limbs, and they would only light it on Christmas Eve, because it can only be lit for so long, or they would have, burned their house down. So of course, it was much more dangerous. But for the most part, the tree would be out and it would just be really pretty. Now, so she's just a happy person. She actually has some little macaroons, which I love. They're one of my favorite sweets. But she takes out they're just coconut, like little sort of cookie confections that have coconut in them. But at least most of them do. The French macaroons are different, but then they're spelled different too. But she comes home, thanks the porter and everything, and then she goes to her husband's door. She cautiously goes to her husband's door and is listening. And she goes, yes, he is in. And then Helmer says, is that my little lark twittering out there? And she says, yes, it is. And then he says, is it my little squirrel bustling about? Yes. When did my squirrel come home? Now, before we move any farther, what were your thoughts as you read this exchange? The little lark twittering, cringe. I kind of agree with you, Addie. It's pretty okay. So Jordan, you even felt weird. Okay, so it's, I mean, it's one thing to have like a nickname or something, but to just be, I think cringe, that's pretty. But even the whole idea of being in an office, you're in the office and you call out through the door, is that my little lark twittering out there? Ew, it's just a little, Oh, now, Brooke, you bring out something that's really important. You said you couldn't tell if it was a daughter and father or husband and wife. This is so important. This is so key. And he sets it up. This is why Ibsen's brilliant. He sets it up from the very beginning. He's going to give suggestions all the way that happen through this, where Helmer makes it very clear that he kind of took over the role of dad from her dad. And that in so many ways, he wanted this innocent little girl that he could come and he could marry, and then he could treat her, she could be his innocent little girl. And this is where we get even the title of the play, that this is a doll's house. He has made this beautiful house, or built, had this beautiful house built and put her in it, and given her money so she can get all these little furnishings and decorate her little house. But she's his doll. She's his little play toy. Well, it is, Jordan, and it's also, but the truth is in reality, if you look at family situations, if you look at relationships, there are quite a few relationships, probably some that you have even seen in your own, among your friends or family or something, that where one person is the parent and one person is the child, where the two people really aren't equal. One person is the one who, earns the most money, is the most responsible. The other one is the one who spends all the money. doesn't do what they're supposed to and is constantly being nagged by the first person. But the truth is that's not a very good positive relationship. And either person can turn this into a parent-child relationship. So they can start it by either a acting like a child or whatever, or acting like a parent and insisting that they're the ones who should make the choices. They're the ones who have all the power. They're the ones who have the most responsibility or deserve to make the choices, who have the tougher life, things like that. And so, but it creates a system where there's a lot of lying that goes on. And this is what we're going to see actually with Nora and Helmer. Well, it's funny too. Now look at their names. Even in the original play, she's Nora. She is not Mrs. Helmer. And yet he is named by his last name because his identifier is that last name. Hers, in this play at least, is going to be herself. Now, at this time though, if she were to go out in public, her address would always be Mrs. Helmer. And in fact, if someone wrote her a letter, it would be to Mrs. Torvald Helmer. Literally. So she's just his wife. I think it was much more common in the day. Well, remember that, if women couldn't even have their own bank account and they couldn't have the right to draw from that bank. I mean, I still remember, and this was not that long ago, like 20 years ago when I was living in South Carolina, my husband and I have always had a joint bank account. We've never had like separate accounts. And yet, if I wanted to transfer money from my checking account to my savings account or the other way around, I had to actually like go through all of these questions about him. I had to know his birthday, his social security number, and then after a while they wouldn't actually do it over the phone. He had to call them. And yet if he called them, he didn't have to supply them with anything because he was, quote, head of household. And this was only 20 years ago. Yes. So the truth is it's still, there are some places where it's still a little weird. Yep, but yes, that's South Carolina is a different place. It really is. It's not Georgia. Okay, so he's all like acting like a, this, oh, is that my little lark? And is that my squirrel? He calls her squirrel a lot. And it's very diminutive. It's meant to be though. And it's not, I don't think he means ill. I don't think he's trying to make her feel small, but it definitely says, this is how I see you. Other things he says too are really important. So she says, she says, when did my squirrel, he says, when did my squirrel come home? She says, just now. Puts the bag of macaroons into her pocket and wipes her mouth. So the macaroons she was eating, the little snack cookies, she hides. Come in here, Torvald, and see what I've bought. And he says, don't disturb me. And it's like, what? And so she has to keep putting her stuff away or sorting her. She has to wait on him. And then finally he comes out. It's just a little later, but there's that long pause. And yes, it should be in the play where there's this break and everybody's like, okay. And we just watch her fidget or whatever, waiting for him to actually come out. And then he says, Bot, did you say all these things? And then he says, has my little spendthrift been wasting money again? That is not something my husband better ever say to me. Oh, have you been throwing away money on Amazon again? Buying a bunch of stuff you don't need? Oh, he says that to me, and I'll be buying a whole lot of stuff I don't need. I mean, it's ridiculous. But so she's a spendthrift. She's not a squirrel anymore. Now she spends too much money. And she says, yes, but this year we really can let ourselves go a little. This is the first Christmas that we've not needed to economize. And he says, but you can't just spend money recklessly. And she's like, oh, come on. And she even uses this little like girly, this little kiddo language. Can't we just a tiny wee bit? you're going to have a big salary and earn lots and lots of money. So she's even talking like a child. So she's answering his assumptions about that. And he says, yes, after the new year, but then it will be a whole quarter before the salary is due. Okay. They were paid, I don't know how often you guys are paid at whatever jobs you guys do. I get paid once a month. That's pretty standard, at least in my existence, with higher education. I've worked at jobs where I was paid every 2 weeks, but and I know some people like who work in certain jobs that they get paid once a week. They were paid, Helmer would have been paid by his job. Okay, so Brooke, you're in that every week. Helmer would have been paid for by his job once every 3 months. Of course, that's when the rents were due too. So once every 3 months, he had to pay his rent on his house, or rent for something, or a lease, or pay on a bill or something like that. Even like if he were getting groceries or whatever, he'd pay for that once a quarter. And then if he were making any money, he'd be paid once a quarter. And so they have to make, you think about, I don't know if your parents were like this. My parents were once a month. It was like, okay, let's get to the end of the month, because we were living paycheck to paycheck. Well, you kind of had to do that even more in this kind of a situation, because he really won't be paid until the end of March is when he'll get his first paycheck for the new job. And she said, and Nora says, oh, but we can borrow until then. So that now you think, oh yeah, credit cards, which they didn't have back then. But then Helmer says, Nora, the same little featherhead. And now she's not a bird, a lark, she's a feather brain. Suppose now that I borrowed 50 pounds today and you spent it all in the Christmas week, and then on New Year's Eve, a slate fell on my head and killed me. In other words, once if he dies, everything comes due. And if they don't have his paycheck, he looks at him, essentially he's saying, look, I'm the one who brings in the money. If I die, you don't got no money, and you're never going to be able to pay that back a loan. And then she says, oh, it's not going to happen. He goes, well, what if it did happen though? And she says, well, if that were to happen, if you were to die, I don't suppose I should care whether I owed money or not. And then now she says some really dippy things right here too. But he says, well, what about the people who'd lent it to you? And she goes, who would bother about them? I don't even know who they are. And then Helmer says something that is bound to rankle every single woman on the face of the planet. He says, that is like a woman. Why is that like a woman, you guys? What in the world is he saying? What's he suggesting about women? Okay, so women are nothing and they have no sense. Well, they know nothing and have no sense, right? They're ignorant. So that's they're ignorant, and even willfully so. Maybe willfully silly. They don't know anything. They don't want to know anything. They just want to play their little silly games. They just want to, girls just want to have fun. They're just Cyndi Lauper. They don't want to be serious. Everything is play. Again, this goes into that idea of the doll and the dollhouse. She just wants her little house to play in and have her little Christmas in and buy her little presents because she's a spendthrift. She doesn't understand the ramifications of debt. That's what he's saying. And he goes, but seriously, Nora, you know what I think about that. No debt, no borrowing. There can be no freedom or beauty about a home life that depends on borrowing and debt. Now, actually, I kind of agree with him in this. I try to, little debt as possible. We too have kept bravely on the straight road so far, and we will go on the same way for the short time longer that there need be any struggle. Okay, so he says we're going to stay out of debt, and then as sure, I'll earn more money, and then we can spend a little more. And so Nora says, okay. And then he goes right back to his cutesy language. Come, come, my little skylark must not droop her wings. And then he says, is my little squirrel out of temper? And then he takes out his purse and says, Noah, what do you think I have got here? And she says, money. And he goes, there you are. And he says, do you think I don't know what that a lot is wanted for housekeeping at Christmas time? So here's some more money for you. But he's the one holding the purse. She can't withdraw any money on her own. She'd have to ask him for everything. And she counts it up and it's 2 whole pounds. Well, I mean, it was in actually other Norwegian coinage before, but that's okay. But she says that will keep me going for a long time. And then she wants to show all the gifts. And I bought it all so cheap. Here's a new suit for Ivor, that's the little boy, and a sword, and a horse and trumpet for Bob, and a doll and Dolly's bedstead for Emmy. And so she bought Christmas gifts for the kids. And here are dress lengths and handkerchiefs for the maids. So she bought a lot of stuff. And what's in this parcel? And she goes, no, you can't see that until this evening. And he says, but now tell me, you extravagant little person, he's still doing that, what would you like for yourself? And she goes, I don't want anything. And she says, but unless, and he goes, well, if you really wanted to give me something, you might, and he goes, out with it, you might give me money. Only just as much as you can afford. And then one of these days I will buy something with it. And he goes, but Nora, oh, please just give me money. No, we will find out very quickly why she wants money. And we're probably going along with it like, dude, she just spent all this money. Now she got more money and she wants even more money. That's probably what the people in the theater are saying. Like, oh my gosh, what is with all these people and money? You know, this girl really is a spendthrift. And she goes, oh, please, then I'll wrap it up in beautiful gilt paper and hang it on the Christmas tree. She goes, and then he says, his answer to this is, what are little people called that are always wasting money? And she says, spendthrifts. I know. And he says, okay, well, that would be a great idea if you were really to save out of the money I give you and then really buy something for yourself. Okay, now this is a really important detail because he says, you don't save the money and you don't buy stuff for yourself. You don't. Instead, you spend it all on housekeeping and unnecessary things. And then I merely have to pay up again. And you know, you're not spending money on yourself. You're not actually buying stuff for yourself with it. And then he repeats again. He calls her sweet little spendthrift, but she uses up a deal of money. One would hardly believe how expensive such little persons are. And she says, I do really save all I can. And he says, he laughs at her and says, that's very true, all you can, but you can't save anything. And she says, you haven't any idea how many expenses we skylarks and squirrels have, Torvald. She's a little ticked, but she's also a little like, hey, I mean, she has her secret and we'll find that out very soon. And he says, you are an odd little soul, very like your father. And of course, she keeps wheedling money from him. And you never know where it has gone. That's fine. That's fine. And she says, I wish I had inherited many of Papa's qualities. And he says, and I would not wish you to be anything but just what you are, my sweet little skylark. Again, he says that. And he says, it strikes me that you are looking rather uneasy today. So finally he notices, okay, maybe something's a little tense or something. And he says, you do. You look uneasy. Look straight at me. She looks at him. And he says, hasn't Miss Sweet Tooth been breaking rules in town today? And she goes, what makes you think that? Hasn't she paid a visit to the confectioner's? That's of course, the sweet shop. Not been nibbling sweets? No. Now we know instantly this is what? When she says, no, certainly not. And he says, yes, not even taking a bite at a macaroon or two? No. Lies, lies, lies. Well, but he is so insistent. Oh, you're not supposed to have eaten Sweet Tooth, Miss Sweet Tooth, buying sweets. Now, does this sound? This sounds like my mother, actually. So you didn't eat both of those cookies, did you? You're just gonna have one, right? So, and I'm just like, well, what's it to you? Is what I felt as a teenager. Like, leave me alone. Let me eat whatever cookies I want. But he's very much, oh, well, the rules are you don't eat sweets. And then she keeps assuring him, no, I didn't, no, I didn't, when we know she did. And he says, there, of course I was only joking. And then she says, I should not think of going against your wishes. So she just did. And he says, no, I'm sure you didn't. Besides, you gave me your word. And then he says, keep your little Christmas secrets to yourself, my darling. They will all be revealed tonight when the Christmas tree is lit, no doubt. And so then we get introduced to a new character, Dr. Rank. And we haven't met him yet, but he's a nice guy. The kids like him. Everybody seems to like him. But he's a friend mostly of Torvald's. And so he's going to come over for the festivities. Let's see. And then Helmer actually talks about her and preps for all the preparations for Christmas last year. And she was making ornaments for the Christmas tree. And yet what is he, obviously I've done that. I've been guilty of putting all sorts of prep into Christmas or other holidays or making presents or something. And but his complaint is it was the dullest 3 weeks I ever spent. And she goes, oh, I didn't find it dull. And he says, but there was precious little result, Nora. Like, it's not like you came up with spectacular anythings. And 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 essentially what happened is the cat tore everything to pieces. And she goes, it's like it was her fault. And he goes, oh, of course you couldn't know that the cat was doing it. You had the best of intentions, but it's a good thing that our hard times are over. And of course, why was she making all of that stuff? Because she couldn't buy it. She couldn't afford it. And yet he didn't like that she'd spent 3 weeks on it. And then he comes back to it and it says, this time I needn't sit here and be dull all alone, and you needn't ruin your dear eyes and your pretty little hands. So in other words, he's upset about those 3 weeks last year, not because the cat tore up everything, but because he spent 3 weeks bored at night when he'd get home from work because she was busy. And so it's all right. It's all about him. It's a little narcissistic. But he also, I mean, for her, what's her role? Her role, yes, is to make a good Christmas, but most important, her role is to take care of him. That's her job. And it's, again, this is a very traditional household. So she's all excited now. She goes, now we're going to have all the time. She doesn't seem to be upset by his whole comments about her pretty little hands or anything like that. And then the bell rings. She goes, there's someone at the door. What a nuisance. He goes, if it's a caller, remember I'm not at home. And he goes back into his office. And then at the same time, Dr. Rank comes. And so the doctor is going to go to Helmer's office. So Helmer's not going to be involved in this next situation. And so Helmer goes into his office, and then Mrs. Lind comes in. Now, who is Mrs. Lind? Or at least, who is she to Nora? Yes, they knew each other really as young women, but before marriage. So they knew each other as they were growing up. And it took her a little bit though. But she does. It actually doesn't take very long at all. She goes, "Yes, Christine, is it really you?" And she says, and Nora actually, she finally says, she goes, "Wow, you've altered. Like, you've changed a lot." and in 9, 10 long years. Now, okay? So Nora, after she knew her classmate Christine, Nora got married to Torvald, right? And she's had several children, 3 kids. Mrs. Lynde, what happened to Mrs. Lynde? Yes. So she actually just came into town by steamer and went straight for Nora. Okay, but it takes her a little while to say what happened. Um, but Nora knows. She actually doesn't have to be told. Well, but you're a widow, and she goes, yes, it's 3 years ago now. So 3 years ago, the man died that she had married. Right, right. And so instead of making an advantageous marriage that she could go and essentially marry a person that she wanted to marry, like Nora did, she married for money, which is actually really common. Women were often, honestly, they were given to people and said, okay, you're going to marry that old dude, because there were financial arrangements made between her dad and the man she was marrying. And it often, women had no pick at all, but even if they did, often there was a lot of pressure involved, um, affecting their choice. So, but then she goes, I saw it in the papers. Nora did. So she did. She and Mrs. Lynde have not been exchanging letters for years. She says, I assure you, I meant ever so often to write to you at the time, but I always put it off and something always prevented me. So I intended to write, but I didn't. But Nora admits freely it was very bad of me. And then it says how you must have suffered and he left you nothing. She says, no, no kids, not even any sorrow or grief to live upon. And then she said, in other words, I don't even miss him. Like there was there was no affection. There was nothing, you know. And she said, and Christine says, is that possible? Like, how can you live with a person for years and years and not, have affection? And she says, it sometimes happens, Nora. Like, don't be silly. And so she says, I have 3 lovely children. She starts to brag, Nora does. This does not put her in the best light. You can't see them just now, for they're out with their nurse, but tell me all about your life now. And Mrs. Lynde says, no, I want to hear about you. And Nora says, no, 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 I'm not going to talk about myself, but let me tell you one thing. My husband's just been made manager at the bank. And she's like, oh, that's awesome. She goes, yes, we're going to make so much more money and everything's so great. And I'm so happy. Even though Mrs. Lynde is obviously not happy. Um, and she says, I think it would be delightful to have what one needs. And she goes, oh, no, no, heaps and heaps of money, not just what we need. And Mrs. Lynde says, Nora, haven't you learned sense yet? In our school days, you were a great spendthrift. And she says, yes, that's what Torvald says now. But Nora is not so silly as you think. We've not been in a position for me to waste money. We've both had to work. And she says, yes. She goes, actually, yes. Odds and ends, needlework, crochet work, embroidery, and other things too. Now we get to an actual truth. This is true stuff. This is not lies, but true. And it says, so when they first got married, during the first year, he overworked himself dreadfully. And he worked early and late, but he couldn't stand it and fell dreadfully ill. And the doctor said it was necessary for him to go south. Well, of course, they're living in Norway, and that's super cold. So, of course, he's going to have to go somewhere nicer. He probably had some lung ailment. But Mrs. Lynde said, you spent a whole year in Italy, didn't you? And she goes, yeah, and it was not easy. It was just after Ivor was born, so one of her sons. But naturally, we had to go. It was a wonderfully beautiful journey, and it saved Torvald's life. But it cost a tremendous lot of money, Christine. And Christine's like, yeah, I can see why it would. I mean, going to Italy for a whole year. And she says it cost about 250 pounds, which, of course, is a translation of the actual amount. And at that time, 250 pounds, like at that time as a governess, you wouldn't have earned 50 pounds a year. And so to suddenly earn 250 pounds, that's a lot. Most governesses probably would have been, I mean, that would have been something they would have earned in about 10 years. A lot of money. And she says, she goes, it's lucky that you had money, you know, during that emergency. And she goes, I ought to tell you that we had it from Papa. That's her dad. And she goes, oh, that was just about the same time that he died, wasn't it? And she goes, yes. And I couldn't go and nurse him. I was expecting little Ivor's birth, so she was about to have a baby herself. And Torvald was sick. And she says, I never saw my father again. And then she says, and then you went off to Italy. And then Nora is confessing. This is a confession. She goes, well, yes, you see, we had money then, and the doctors insisted on our going, so we started a month later. And then he came back well. And then she says, oh, but is he well? What about the doctor who came at the same time I did? Oh, no, that's Dr. Rank. He doesn't come here. He's not a doctor. He's just a really good friend. And she says, Norvald hasn't had any more illness since then. Children are strong and healthy. And then she says, wait a second, I'm only talking about myself. So then tell me, is it really true you didn't love your husband? Why did you marry him? My mother was alive then and was bedridden. She married him. And this is where she tells, just like Jordan said in the chat, this is where she says, and I had to provide for my two younger brothers. So I did think I was justified. So I did not think I was justified in refusing his offer. In other words, because I had to take care of my mom and my two little brothers because dad had died, I didn't feel like I had a choice. I had to get married to this man, even though I didn't love him. And then she says, Nora asked, well, he was rich at the time. And she says, I believe he was quite well off, but his business was a precarious one. And when he died, it all went to pieces and there was nothing left, which is honestly a big nightmare. Because remember, women didn't typically work. Right. And even if they did work, this was long before even, what is it today? I think women earn like 80 cents to every man's dollar in the same professions, even now. Well, they earned a whole lot less then. And there were only a few kinds of jobs they could do. Remember when Nora said she was earning money herself? Most of it was through piecework. She was doing crocheting, she was sewing things, she was doing needlework and then selling that. It's not a way to make much money, but it was what she was limited to. There were things she just can't do. And so Mrs. Lynn said, well, I didn't have any money. And so I did, essentially, she tried anything she could find, a small shop, then a small school. And then all she's done is work, 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 work. But her mother has passed away. And the boys do not need me either. They've got situations and can shift for themselves. And she says, you must feel relieved. And she goes, no, I feel my life unspeakably empty. No one to live for anymore. That was why I could not stand the life of my little backwater any longer. So she's moved. And she goes, what I want is something that makes me feel like getting up in the morning. I want a job, office work of some kind. And Nora says, but isn't that tiring to work? She goes, you look tired now. And she says, you'd better go away to some watering place, like a spa, and recover. And she goes, I don't have any father to give me money for a journey. And Nora's like, don't be angry with me. And she goes, it's you that must not be angry with me. She goes, you don't understand. If I had a job, the worst of all of this is that I'm bitter. I don't have any chance to earn what I want. She goes, I get selfish because I don't have any money. When you told me of the happy turn your fortunes have taken, I was delighted not so much on your account as on my own. And what that means is she was hoping that maybe Torvald and Nora could help her get a job. And she admits that that was exactly what I was thinking, that Torvald could help me find a job. And Nora says, I'll talk to him. Absolutely, I will. I'll broach the subject very cleverly, and it will make me so happy if I could help you. So Nora is a nice person. She's just, privileged. And she says, it's doubly kind of you, for you know little of the burdens and troubles. But the truth is Nora does know more than she lets off. So we think she's just a silly little flitty whatever at the beginning of this play. And that's certainly what Torvald thinks. And that's certainly the vibe she gives off, but we're going to learn a little bit different. And she even gets told by Mrs. Lynde, you know, you don't have much to really care for. You're a child. And Nora doesn't appreciate that remark. And she says, you were just like the others. They all think I'm incapable of anything really serious. That I have gone through the world, through nothing in this world of cares. And she says, I have not told you the important thing. Now, what happened? What did she do? So she admits, she says, I know you've worked really hard to Christine. She says, I know you've worked really hard to take care of your mom and your brothers. And you're right, you know, you are proud of what you've done. And she says, but now listen to this. I too have something to be proud and glad of. And she said, remember Torvald being sick, and he had to get well. Right now, Mr. Krogstad's going to will at least threaten to spill the beans. She goes, let me show you what I've done. And she goes, I told you about a trip to Italy. Torvald would never have recovered if he had not gone there. And she says, but your father supplied those funds. She goes, no. Papa didn't give us a shilling. I procured the money. And she says, all that large sum. The truth is there's no way legally she could ever have borrowed that kind of money. She couldn't have borrowed any money, but she certainly couldn't have borrowed like a year's worth of vacation money. And she goes, 250 pounds I borrowed. And she goes, how did you do that? Did you win a prize in the lottery? She goes, no, there would have been no credit in that. No, it wasn't. I didn't just win it. And so where did you get it? She goes, I borrowed it. And she goes, you couldn't have borrowed it. And Mrs. Lynde says, you couldn't have borrowed it. And she goes, oh, I couldn't? Why not? And it says, a wife cannot borrow without her husband's consent or her father's, one of the two. And she goes, I never said I borrowed the money. I may have got it some other way. Perhaps I got it from some other admirer. And she's like, oh, come on, you're insane. And she goes, so how did that happen? And Mrs. Lynde says it's imprudent. What you did was imprudent without his knowledge. And she goes, okay, look, it was to me. She goes, look, I'm stronger than I seem. And it was necessary. It was dangerous. I had no choice than to do what I did. It was to me, the doctors came and said his life was in danger and that he had to move. So she actually tried to get him to move. So I told him how much I should love to travel abroad. I tried tears and entreaties, and he wouldn't go. And he didn't know, the doctors didn't tell him how dangerous it was. They told her, and she couldn't get him to go along with it. And so he said I was thoughtless. They were afraid actually to tell him because they were afraid it would hurt him because he was so ill. And he said I was thoughtless, that it was his duty as my husband not to indulge in my whims and caprices. And so she's like, I had to get the money somewhere else because he wasn't going to pay it. And then she said, did your husband never get to know from your father that the money had not come from him? And she goes, no, Papa died just at that time. I had meant to let him into the secret and beg him never to reveal it, but he was so ill. And she never saw him again, the dad. And she's never told her husband that she's the one who got the money. And why? She says, and since then you've never told your secret to your husband? And she goes, oh, no. A man who has such strong opinions about these things? No. And how painful and humiliating it would be for Torvald, with his manly independence, to know that he owed me anything. Nope, can't tell him. So it's not just the macaroons that are a secret. It's a much bigger thing that she took out a loan. And the truth is, what she did was illegal. It was illegal. And so, but it's cost her since. She's of course kept this secret all this time. And where she got borrowed the money, she goes, it has quarterly interest and another thing called payment in installments. And it's always so dreadfully difficult to manage them. I had to save a little here and a little there. So now we go back to that request she made. He gave her £2, and then she said, "Oh, couldn't you just give me more money for Christmas so I could buy myself something?" And he says, "Well, you never spend any money on yourself. You just buy other stuff, unnecessary things." What's she really taking all that money and collecting it for? All of that money that she's supposedly spendthrifting and spending on stupid stuff, she's actually paying those installments back to Mr. Krogstad. And she has been doing so for years and allowing her husband to think she's just a spendthrift when she is not. So now we know this is what really, anytime that I was supposed to get clothes, I paid on the loan instead. She goes, "Won't it be nice when this is all paid off?" And so she did copying. She did, remember, she already mentioned the sewing things that she did. So sometimes she was writing every evening until quite late. And she was exhausted. And so she goes, so far she's paid everything she could scrape together, she's paid. And so essentially that is going to have to, I mean, it's still, she hasn't paid it all over, all back yet, but she is about to. That's what she's hoping to do, is make it so that with this raise and everything else, she can pay off everything and be done. And so if that happens, then she'll probably, will she ever tell Torvald? Nah. She doesn't want to, she just wants to pay it back and have it all disappear, right? Now, Mrs. Lynde is just, here's another bell ring, and there's a gentleman to see her, and this is Mr. Krogstad. We will stop there, though, and so we will stop on page, I don't even know what page this is, but we'll stop at the point when Krogstad comes in, because he will figure us. It's not a big, long cast. It's not going to be like The Tempest, where you're not going to be able to keep track of all these people. What I would suggest, honestly, that you do is print off the page with the cast members on it when you're reading the Tempest, so that you can keep them straight. Because there's the prince of this, and then the people are brothers of each other, and all sorts of other stuff. So you want to make sure you keep all that straight. Do you guys have any questions? If you do, go ahead and put them in. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, though, and then we will just continue where we left off right here. Okay. Okay, well, if